On December 25, 2025, the United States military conducted airstrikes on Nigerian soil. The target was ISWAP, the Islamic State's West Africa province, operating in Sokoto State. The Nigerian government officially welcomed the assistance, but the fact that US forces struck inside Nigeria's borders on Christmas Day without a formal status of forces agreement, without advance public notification to the Nigerian legislature, is a statement about the state of Nigerian sovereignty that no diplomatic communique can fully paper over. On April 1, 2026, less than 1 week ago, Senator Ted Cruz posted a specific warning on X in response to the Palm Sunday killings of at least 28 Christians in Jos. His exact words, "Nigerian government officials have created an environment in which Christians are routinely persecuted and slaughtered by imposing Sharia law and looking the other way at violence. Those officials should know that the US knows who they are and has the tools to hold them accountable." On April 8, 2026, yesterday, the United States Department of State authorized the voluntary departure of non-emergency US government employees and their families from the US Embassy in Abuja. 23 of Nigeria's 36 states are now under a Level 4 Do Not Travel warning, the highest risk designation the US State Department issues. This is not a speech, this is not a press release, this is the documented sequence of how Washington's posture towards Nigeria moved from diplomatic language to military action to personal accountability threats to partial embassy withdrawal in 6 months. And the question AFRONEWSHQ is asking today is not whether the US is wrong. The question is whether Nigeria is running out of time to control what happens next before Washington decides for it. Most channels give you the headline. We give you the architecture behind it. If you have never been here before, you just found Nigeria's most analytical political channel. Subscribe, because what comes next is the threat assessment that Aso Rock should have commissioned 6 months ago. Step 1. September 2025, Senator Ted Cruz introduces the Nigeria Religious Freedom Accountability Act. In September 2025, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's subcommittee on Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, and Counterterrorism, introduced a formal bill, the Nigeria Religious Freedom Accountability Act. The bill has 3 specific instruments. First, it requires the Secretary of State to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. Second, it imposes targeted sanctions on Nigerian officials who facilitate violence against Christians and other religious minorities. Third, it imposes targeted sanctions on Nigerian officials who enforce Sharia and blasphemy laws. This was not a tweet, it was a piece of legislation introduced in the United States Senate with the specific intent of creating a legal mechanism for personal sanctions against named Nigerian government officials. Cruz Bill, Senator Ted Cruz, Nigeria Religious Freedom Accountability Act, introduced September 9, 2025. 3 provisions: CPC designation, sanctions on officials facilitating violence against Christians, and sanctions on Nigerian officials enforcing Sharia and blasphemy laws. Source: cruz.senate.gov, press release, September 2025.
Step 2. October 31st, 2025. Trump redesignated Nigeria as Country of Particular Concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. On October 31st, 2025, President Donald Trump announced via Truth Social that Nigeria had been redesignated as a Country of Particular Concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. The CPC designation is not merely symbolic. It is a formal U.S. government determination that Nigeria is engaged in or tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. Under the IRFA, the designation requires the US to take targeted responses and opens the legal pathway for economic sanctions, restrictions on foreign assistance, opposition to the World Bank and IMF loans, and trade restrictions. Nigeria now sits on a CPC list alongside China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, Cuba, and Eritrea. Step 3. November 1, 2025. Trump threatened military intervention and full aid cutoff. One day after the CPC designation, Trump escalated further. On Truth Social, he posted that if the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the United States would immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria and may very well go into that, quoting Trump's exact words, disgraced country, guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible atrocities. He instructed the Pentagon to prepare for possible action. He instructed Representatives Riley Moore and Tom Cole to investigate and report. The Nigerian government responded that the characterization of Nigeria as religiously intolerant does not reflect its national reality. Nigerian presidential spokesperson Bayo Onanuga told a newspaper that Senator Cruz should stop these malicious, contrived lies. Step 4. December 25, 2025. US Christmas Day airstrikes in Sokoto. On Christmas Day 2025, the United States Africa Command conducted airstrikes on ISWAP targets in Sokoto State. This was not a NATO operation. It was not a UN-mandated action. It was a unilateral US military strike on Nigerian soil. Trump stated afterward that he had warned the terrorists that if they did not stop the slaughtering of Christians, there would be hell to pay. The Nigerian government's decision to officially welcome the strikes while simultaneously asserting its sovereignty placed it in the diplomatically untenable position of endorsing the principle that the US may strike within Nigeria when it determines that the security situation requires it. Step 5. January 1, 2026. Partial travel restrictions on Nigerian nationals. Effective January 1, 2026, the White House issued Proclamation 10949 imposing partial travel restrictions on Nigerian nationals, citing a 5.56% B1 and B2 visa overstay rate and security concerns regarding vetting. The restrictions primarily target new immigrant and specific non-immigrant visas. The practical consequence: disruption to the flow of Nigeria's approximately $20 billion in annual diaspora remittances, which constitute a critical economic lifeline for millions of Nigerian households. Step 6. April 1, 2026. Cruz warns the US knows who they are. On Palm Sunday, March 30th and 31st, 2026, at least 28 Christians were killed in Angwan Rukuwa in the Gariya area of Jos Plateau State in a jihadist attack. On April 1, 2026, Senator Cruz posted his most explicit threat yet. Nigerian government officials have created an environment in which Christians are routinely persecuted and slaughtered by imposing Sharia law and looking the other way at violence. Those officials should know that the US knows who they are and has the tools to hold them accountable. Senator Riley Moore separately posted that if the Nigerian government does not massively ramp up security for Easter, the blood of the martyrs will be on their hands and there will be significant consequences for Nigeria's relationship with the United States. Cruz and Moore posts April 1, 2026. Senator Ted Cruz post on X, April 1, 2026. Those officials should know that the US knows who they are and has the tools to hold them accountable. Senator Riley Moore post April 1, 2026. If they don't take this threat seriously and mobilize to defend our brothers and sisters in Christ, the blood of these martyrs will be on their hands and there will be significant consequences for Nigeria's relationship with the United States.
Source: New Dawn Nigeria, The Nigerian Lawyer, April 1, 2026. Step 7. April 8, 2026. US Embassy Abuja authorizes staff departure. On April 8, 2026, the U.S. Department of State authorized the voluntary departure of non-emergency U.S. government employees and their families from the U.S. Embassy in Abuja. The embassy stated it will remain open but will have limited ability to provide emergency services to U.S. citizens. The updated travel advisory added 5 new states, Plateau, Jigawa, Kwara, Niger, and Taraba, to the Level 4 Do Not Travel list, bringing the total to 23 of Nigeria's 36 states under the highest travel risk warning. Reuters noted that the decision signals heightened concern in Washington as kidnappings, banditry, and attacks on security forces persist. Nigeria's Information Ministry issued a response. While we acknowledge isolated security challenges in some areas, there is no general breakdown of law and order, and the vast majority of the country remains stable. Embassy departure April 8, 2026. Official U.S. Embassy Abuja security alert, April 8, 2026. The Department of State authorized the voluntary departure of non-emergency U.S. government employees and family members from U.S. Embassy Abuja due to the deteriorating security situation. 23 states now at Level 4 Do Not Travel, including new additions Plateau, Jigawa, Kwara, Niger, and Taraba. Embassy closed for visa appointments. Source: ng.usembassy.gov, U.S. State Department Travel Advisory, April 8, 2026. Senator Cruz said in November 2025 that he intends to be very explicit about who they are in the coming days and weeks regarding the Nigerian officials he accuses of facilitating violence. As of April 11, 2026, he has not publicly named any specific individual in a formal legal proceeding. His April 1 statement said the U.S. knows who they are and has the tools to hold them accountable. The difference between "I intend to name them" and actually naming them in a sanctioned document is legally and diplomatically significant. We will return to why that gap matters and what changes if Cruz actually files specific names in the context of his bill. Nigeria's former Chief of Defense Staff, General Lucky Irabo, stated in a Channels television interview that politicians are among the financiers of terrorism in Nigeria and that their identities cannot be disclosed because their trials were conducted away from public consumption. A retired Major General Ali Kefi called for a probe into the release of 48 terror financing suspects from military custody, including a man he identified as a top Boko Haram leader. This is not Cruz's allegation. This is a Nigerian general and a retired Nigerian military officer making the same allegation about Nigerian political figures financing terrorism from inside Nigeria. We will return to what it means when the most credentialed Nigerian military voices are saying something structurally similar to what Ted Cruz is saying from Washington. What the bill actually does. The Nigeria Religious Freedom Accountability Act, introduced by Cruz in September 2025, is not simply a condemnation resolution. It has 3 operative mechanisms that would come into force if passed and signed. The first mechanism is the CPC designation requirement, already achieved through executive action by Trump in October 2025. Under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, a CPC designation requires the U.S. to take targeted responses. The president has a menu of options: a waiver, a sanctions package, an agreement with the designated country to take specified actions, or a negotiated binding commitment. None of these options are consequence-free for the designated country. Nigeria is currently operating under the CPC designation without a formal negotiated response in place. The second mechanism is the targeted sanctions instrument. The bill specifically calls for sanctions on Nigerian officials who facilitate violence against Christians and other religious minorities, including by Islamist terrorist groups. Under the U.S. Magnitsky Act framework, sanctions against named individuals, include asset freezes, visa bans, and prohibition on financial transactions with U.S. persons or institutions. When Cruz says the U.S. knows who they are and has the tools to hold them accountable, he is describing this specific legal instrument. He does not need to win a court case. He needs to convince the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control to list specific individuals. Once listed, those individuals are frozen out of the dollar-denominated international financial system. The third mechanism targets officials who enforce Sharia and blasphemy laws. This is the most constitutionally controversial instrument because it effectively treats the enforcement of legal codes that operate within Nigeria's own constitutional framework as a sanctionable activity under U.S. law. Nigeria's constitution permits Sharia courts in 12 northern states for matters of personal status among Muslim populations. The bill's scope, if enacted as written, would create a specific accountability framework for officials operating within that constitutional arrangement. The honest assessment of Cruz's political context. AFRONEWSHQ must state clearly what the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Crisis Group, and Al Jazeera have all documented. Senator Cruz counts evangelical Christians among his core political constituency. His Senate seat in Texas is up for re-election. The Nigeria issue provides a visible, internationally legible platform on which to demonstrate religious freedom advocacy to that constituency. The framing of Nigeria's security crisis as a straightforward Christian genocide, which Cruz has used consistently, overstates the religiosity of a conflict that has documented ethnic, resource, economic, and geopolitical dimensions alongside its religious ones. Al Jazeera's analysis noted that Boko Haram and ISWAP have attacked both Christians and Muslims, and that the conflict in the Middle Belt has deep Fulani herder roots that predate recent jihadist activity. That assessment matters, but it does not change the operational consequence of the Cruz bill if it becomes law. The legal effect of targeted sanctions on named Nigerian officials under a CPC designation that is already in force is real, regardless of the electoral calculation behind it. Here is the most analytically important statement in this entire US-Nigeria crisis that Nigerian political analysis has not engaged with adequately. Nigeria's own former Chief of Defense Staff stated publicly on Channels Television that politicians are among the financiers of terrorism in Nigeria and that their identities cannot be disclosed because their trials were conducted away from public consumption. And a retired Nigerian Army Major General called for a probe into the release of 48 terror financing suspects from military custody. If those claims are accurate, then Ted Cruz is not making a foreign allegation about Nigeria. He is reading back to Abuja a set of claims that originated inside Nigeria's own military and security establishment. The question of why Nigerian authorities have not publicly prosecuted or named those individuals is not a question Cruz invented. It is a question that Nigeria's own defense community has placed on the record.
What an authorized departure actually signifies. An authorized departure is a specific classification in U.S. State Department diplomatic protocol. It means the department has determined that security conditions have deteriorated sufficiently to justify allowing non-essential staff and family members to leave at U.S. government expense ahead of any mandatory evacuation order. It is distinct from an ordered departure, which is mandatory, and from a full evacuation, which closes an embassy. The US Embassy in Abuja will remain open. The consulate in Lagos will continue full services, but the signal an authorized departure sends to the global diplomatic, investment and insurance communities is specific and consequential. Reuters explicitly noted that US travel advisories often shape how investors, international organizations and airlines assess country risk.
The move to allow staff departures signals heightened concern in Washington. When a major Western embassy begins reducing its Abuja footprint, even voluntarily, even without a mandatory evacuation order, the risk assessment models used by insurance underwriters, foreign direct investment analysts, and sovereign debt rating agencies update. That update does not wait for a formal sanctions package. It happens in real time in the pricing adjustments of Nigeria's commercial relationships with the global financial system. The 23-state mapping. 23 of Nigeria's 36 states are now under Level 4 Do Not Travel warnings. Let us map what that means geographically. The Level 4 states include Borno, Yobe, Adamawa, and Northern Adamawa in the northeast, the Boko Haram and ISWAP core operating zone. Kogi, Kwara, Niger, Plateau, Jigawa, and Taraba in the Middle Belt and North Central zone. Bauchi, Gombe, Kaduna, Kano, Katsina, Sokoto, and Zamfara across the northwest. And Abia, Anambra, Bayelsa, Delta, Enugu, Imo, and Rivers in the southeast and Niger Delta. That geographic spread covers Nigeria's northeast, northwest, north central, and southeast simultaneously, not a localized crisis description, but a near national security assessment by the world's most diplomatically consequential country. US Embassy Official Statement and Travel Advisory. US Embassy Abuja Security Alert, April 8, 2026. US Department of State Nigeria Travel Advisory, updated April 8, 2026. Level 3 National Advisory, 23 states at Level 4 Do Not Travel. New Level 4 additions, Plateau, Jigawa, Kwara, Niger, Taraba. Embassy Limited Emergency Services Capacity confirmed. Visa appointments suspended. Source: ng.usembassy.gov, travel.state.gov. Reuters, April 9, 2026. Here is the investment consequence that Nigerian financial commentary is not yet pricing clearly. The US travel advisory at Level 4 across 23 states is not just a warning to American tourists, it is a signal to the institutions that price Nigerian sovereign risk. Every foreign direct investment decision made by a US-based institution about Nigeria involves a country risk assessment that the State Department's travel advisory directly informs. Every insurance policy on US-linked businesses operating in those 23 states is subject to repricing when the State Department formally adds new states to the Level 4 list. And every conversation Nigeria has with the IMF, the World Bank, and bilateral creditors about its debt restructuring, its currency stabilization, and its 2027 electoral stability happens in an environment where the US government has just formally stated that its own staff cannot safely remain in the capital without authorization to depart. That is not an abstract diplomatic signal, it is a credit event in slow motion. What the Nigerian government has said. Nigeria's official responses to the US pressure have been consistent and on specific factual points legitimate. Presidential spokesperson Bayo Onanuga challenged Cruz to stop these malicious contrived lies and asserted that Christians are not targeted in Nigeria. Nigeria's Information Ministry responded to the April 8 embassy departure by stating, "While we acknowledge isolated security challenges in some areas, there is no general breakdown of law and order, and the vast majority of the country remains stable." The Christian Association of Nigeria, crucially, said that the killings in the country do not target Christians alone and that foreign groups are looking to exploit domestic crises. That statement is analytically significant. It comes from the representative body of Nigerian Christians, not from the government, and it explicitly rejects the Christian genocide framing that Cruz has built his legislative campaign around. President Tinubu himself
stated that the characterization of Nigeria as religiously intolerant does not reflect Nigeria's national reality. The strongest counter-argument to Cruz's framing is documented by multiple credible analysts, including the International Crisis Group, Al Jazeera, and CFR. Nigeria's security crisis in the Middle Belt and Northwest is not reducible to Christian persecution. It has documented ethnic dimensions, Fulani herder versus farming community conflicts that predate recent jihadist activity. It has resource competition dimensions, land, water, and cattle routes. And it has state capacity dimensions, a security apparatus that is chronically underfunded, understaffed, and geographically overstretched. Reducing that complex crisis to a religious binary, which Cruz has consistently done, serves a specific political constituency in the United States without necessarily advancing the security outcomes that the people of Plateau State actually need. Where the counter-argument has its own limits. The Nigerian government's counter-argument has two specific limits that its official communication has not adequately addressed. First, the claim that Nigeria is religiously tolerant does not explain why 12 northern states have blasphemy laws that carry the death penalty, why specific individuals have been lynched for alleged blasphemy, and why those responsible have not been systematically prosecuted. The Constitution guarantees religious freedom. The enforcement of that guarantee at state level is inconsistent in documented ways that neither government statements nor general tolerance narratives resolve. Second, the claim that there is no general breakdown of law and order is harder to sustain simultaneously with a travel advisory covering 23 of 36 states. The Nigerian government's position that these are isolated security challenges is formally accurate in the sense that no state has completely ceased to function, but the cumulative effect of those isolated challenges, measured in displaced persons, in killed civilians, in school closures, in collapsed agricultural activity across the Middle Belt, constitutes a security failure whose scale is not adequately captured by the word isolated. Drop a comment below. How should Nigeria respond to this US pressure? And is Ted Cruz's framing helping or hurting Nigeria's actual security situation? Comment before we get to the part that changes the calculation entirely. Economic consequences. The $20 billion in annual diaspora remittances are the country's second largest source of foreign exchange after oil. The bulk of that flow passes through dollar-denominated channels. Any sanctions designation of Nigerian officials under the OFAC framework that Cruz's bill would activate does not require the sanctions to target remittance companies directly. It requires only that financial institutions with US exposure become cautious about Nigeria-linked transactions to avoid secondary sanctions liability. That caution, even without formal restrictions, produces remittance channel contraction. The partial visa restrictions already in force since January 1, 2026 have created processing delays and uncertainty that affect remittance flows in ways that are not captured by any single dramatic headline, but accumulate into household income disruption across millions of Nigerian families. The CPC designation also opens the pathway for the US to oppose World Bank and IMF lending to Nigeria. Under the IRFA, the US can use its voting weight at international financial institutions to block or complicate specific programs. Nigeria is currently managing a complex IMF engagement, currency management challenges, and foreign debt obligations that require continued access to international capital markets. Any formal deterioration in its CPC status from designation to sanction non-compliance would introduce a specific risk premium into Nigeria's sovereign borrowing cost that the economy in its current state cannot easily absorb. Diplomatic consequences. The bilateral relations at their lowest point since the 1970s. The International Crisis Group documented that US-Nigeria relations have reached their lowest point since the 1970s when the two countries were at odds over apartheid South Africa.
That is a specific and historically grounded assessment. The Atlantic Council noted in November 2025 that Tinubu's contacts with the Trump administration appear to be limited. His first meeting with Masad Boulos, Trump's senior advisor for Africa, occurred only in April 2025 in Paris, signaling the absence of any ongoing back-channel relationship at the senior level. Nigeria still had not formally appointed a full ambassador to Washington as of late 2025, citing financial constraints. The diplomatic consequence of that relational gap is specific. When a crisis escalates, there is no trusted back channel through which Nigerian concerns can be communicated informally to the Trump administration before they become public confrontations. The Palm Sunday killings became a Ted Cruz public threat within 48 hours precisely because the off-ramp of a direct presidential conversation, the kind that exists between close bilateral allies, was not available. Nigeria's diplomatic isolation from the Trump administration is not an abstract foreign policy problem. It is an operational constraint that leaves Abuja with no ability to shape Washington's posture before it hardens into legislation. Domestic consequences. The Tinubu Balancing Act. The Atlantic Council captured the specific domestic challenge precisely. Tinubu, himself a Muslim, faces a delicate balancing act in a country roughly evenly divided between Muslims and Christians. Any response to US pressure that is perceived domestically as capitulation to American demands on Sharia law or northern governance structures will produce a political backlash in the north that Tinubu cannot afford 9 months before a general election. Any response that is perceived as inadequate by Nigerian Christians will deepen the narrative of government indifference to southern and middle belt security, a narrative that feeds directly into the ADC opposition coalition's 2027 mobilization argument. The Tinubu administration is therefore managing a simultaneous pressure from Washington to demonstrate accountability for religiously motivated violence and a pressure from northern political constituencies not to make any concession to American framing of northern governance as persecution. Those two pressures are not both satisfiable through a single policy response, and the longer the insecurity in Plateau State, the Middle Belt and the Northwest continues without a visible and credible security improvement, the more both pressures intensify simultaneously. Senator Cruz said he intends to be very explicit about who the officials are in the coming days and weeks. That statement was made in November 2025. As of April 2026, he has not named specific individuals in a formal legal or legislative document. What he has done is create the public record of the threat, which has already produced its primary effect, the awareness among every senior Nigerian official with US-linked financial exposure that their names are being compiled. The chilling effect of a credible, publicly stated intent to name and sanction does not wait for the list to be published. It operates in the period of uncertainty before publication, and that period has now extended for 5 months without resolution, which for the officials in question is not a reprieve but a sustained anxiety.
Nigeria's own military establishment has placed on the record claims that are structurally similar to Cruz's allegations. General Irabo's statement that politicians are among terrorism financiers and General Ali Kefi's demand for a probe into released terror suspects are not Cruz's claims imported into Nigeria. They are Nigerian military claims that predate Cruz's campaign. The question of why those claims have not been acted upon by Nigerian civilian authorities is the domestic accountability question that the US pressure is, whatever its political motivation, making impossible to avoid answering publicly. The immediate actions that would change Washington's calculation. The first thing Nigeria must do is resolve the ambassador deficit. Abuja has not had a confirmed, credentialed ambassador in Washington for a period that has now extended through a critical phase of US-Nigeria relations. A country that sends a chargé d'affaires to manage a relationship that involves military strike discussions, CPC designations, and congressional sanction legislation is not a country communicating that it takes the relationship seriously.
An ambassador with direct access to the Trump administration's Africa senior advisor does not guarantee a positive outcome, but the absence of one guarantees the outcome is shaped entirely by Cruz, Moore, and the evangelical Christian advocacy organizations that have been the primary Nigerian lobby in Washington since November 2025. The second action is a credible, publicly communicated accountability measure for religiously motivated violence that does not require Tinubu to make any statement about Sharia law, but does produce specific prosecution outcomes for documented attacks. The Palm Sunday Jos killings must not follow the pattern of the previous 30 documented attacks, investigated, condemned, and forgotten. A single high-profile prosecution and conviction in the Plateau State case, with the process and outcome publicly communicated to both Nigerian and US audiences, would change the narrative dynamic in Congress more effectively than any number of diplomatic protests against Cruz's framing. The third action is a formal security engagement with the United States that produces a documented framework for cooperation, ideally before Senator Cruz's next formal legislative move. The December 25 airstrikes on ISWAP in Sokoto occurred outside any formal bilateral security framework, formalizing that cooperation under Nigerian terms with Nigerian oversight with explicit sovereignty protections converts a unilateral US action into a bilateral security partnership. That conversion is diplomatically important, legally protective, and removes the narrative space within which Cruz can continue to frame Nigeria as a government that is either complicit in or indifferent to the violence. How much time remains? The Cruz bill has not yet passed the full Senate. It has been introduced. A CPC designation is in force. Airstrikes have been conducted. Embassy staff have begun departing. Visa restrictions are operating. The escalation ladder has 6 rungs already climbed. The 7th rung, formal individual sanctions against named Nigerian officials under OFAC authority, is the one that converts a diplomatic crisis into a financial and reputational crisis of a different order of magnitude. The window between where we are today, a country with a CPC designation, a partial embassy departure, and a senator with a list he has not yet published, is not indefinite. It is the window of a legislative calendar. Cruz's bill is in committee. The Trump administration has demonstrated a willingness to use executive sanctions authority outside the legislative process when it chooses to, as the OFAC sanctions against other country officials in the past 2 years demonstrate. If there is a major security event in Nigeria between now and the Cruz bill's next committee action that produces American casualties or a sufficiently dramatic escalation, the timeline compresses sharply.
Nigeria has months, not years. The question is whether the Tinubu administration understands that the window is measured in months and whether it has the institutional capacity, the political will, and the bilateral relationship infrastructure to act within that window before Washington decides for it. We opened with 3 documented facts: a US Christmas Day airstrike on Nigerian soil, a US senator saying the United States knows who the Nigerian officials are and has the tools to hold them accountable, and the US Embassy in Abuja beginning to withdraw its non-essential staff. The analytical frame that connects those 3 facts is simple. The United States has moved in 6 months from designating Nigeria a country of particular concern to conducting unilateral military strikes inside Nigeria's borders, to personally threatening government officials, to beginning a partial embassy drawdown. Each of those actions, taken individually, is manageable. Taken together, in sequence, they represent a documented escalation toward the kind of bilateral relationship deterioration that produces formal sanctions, AGOA withdrawal, and World Bank loan opposition, the tools that would materially compound every economic problem Nigeria is already managing. Nigeria is not running out of time in the sense that catastrophe is imminent.
It is running out of time in the sense that the actions required to change Washington's trajectory are time-sensitive, relationship-dependent, and institutionally demanding, and Nigeria's current posture toward the United States, characterized by protest, denial, and ambassador vacancy, is not the posture of a country that understands the window is closing. The security crisis in Plateau State, the Middle Belt, and the Northwest is real, complex, and predates Cruz's campaign. The framing of that crisis as Christian genocide is politically motivated, analytically reductive, and in specific respects factually inaccurate. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the combination of a real crisis and a politically motivated but legally operable response from Washington is more dangerous than either would be alone. Track the Cruz bill. Track whether an ambassador is appointed to Washington. Track whether there is a prosecution in the Plateau State Palm Sunday case. Track whether the next security incident in Nigeria produces a formal OFAC filing. Those four signals will tell you before any analyst does whether Nigeria is managing this crisis or being managed by it. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight do not know. What you do with it is up to you. Share it, debate it, challenge it. That is how democracies survive. AFRONEWSHQ. Nigeria deserves better analysis. See you in the next one.